40 cows stood beneath a dead sycamore that had not cast a useful patch of shade in 5 years. Their stock tank was full, 600 feet away. There was grass on both sides of them, plenty of it, green and untouched. Still, by noon, every animal Eli Mercer owned had gathered around that white, branchless trunk as if the county map had forgotten to mark something there. He watched them from the truck for a long moment before he even shut the engine off. It was the 3rd day in a row they had done it, and by now he had stopped assuming it would pass. This is the story of how Eli Mercer bought 105 acres that the county swore had no water on it, and how his cattle proved, in their own slow and wordless way, that the county was only half right. Eli was 46 that spring, a cattleman who had spent 14 years grazing land that never belonged to him. He leased 95 acres from a widow named Opal Gans, a fair arrangement that had suited them both since 1974. Eli kept the fences up and paid on time, and Opal never raised the rent past what a man running 40 cow-calf pairs could reasonably carry. Opal died in February of 1988, in her sleep at 81. Her children lived in Springfield and Tulsa and had no interest in cattle or in tenants. By March, the pasture was listed with a real estate agent, and Eli had 90 days to find somewhere else to put 40 head or start selling them at spring prices, which were not good prices, not that year. He had about $12,000 set aside, a paid-off tractor that ran when it wanted to, an old Ford pickup, and the herd itself, 35 cows with calves at side, 5 open. He looked at pasture all through Barton County that spring, and what he found confirmed something he already suspected. A man with $12,000 was not going to buy good grass. Good grass, fenced and watered, was going for $300–400 an acre that year, crisis or no crisis. What Eli could afford was the land nobody else wanted. That was how he came to stand at the edge of 105 acres listed for $18,000. Reading the county record sheet a second time, because the first reading had seemed too discouraging to be complete. The sheet did not improve on a second look. Poor fencing, no pond, no well of record, no developed or certified water source, an abandoned barn with half its roof gone, a strip of seasonal drainage cutting through the center field, dry more months than not. 22 acres grown up in hedge, locust, and brush that would take years to clear, and near the middle of the open pasture, a single dead sycamore, noted on the plat only as a survey reference point, nothing more, nothing about what might be under it, because nobody had thought to ask. The well driller Eli called out to look at the property was named Curtis Fain, and he did not waste words. He walked the field, looked at the drainage cut, and told Eli a new well out here could run him $9,000 to $12,000. With no promise at all he'd hit anything worth pumping. "You could spend everything you've got and still be hauling water in a truck," Curtis said. Walter Crane, who ran cattle on the good ground half a mile east, told Eli about the same thing in fewer words. Walter was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, and in Barton County that spring, practical men were in no mood for optimism. "There's nothing wrong with the price," Walter said, leaning on Eli's truck bed one afternoon. "The problem is everything attached to it. $18,000 for 105 acres with no water is still $18,000 you can't get back if it doesn't work out." Eli didn't argue with him, he mostly agreed. But the arithmetic of his situation left him little choice. 60 of those 105 acres were open grass that, with some fence work, could carry his herd through the growing season. He could haul water from the highway tank while he decided whether a well was worth the risk. It was not a plan built on hope. It was a plan built on running out of better options. He closed on the farm in the first week of April. For the first 2 weeks, Eli was too busy with fence to think much about anything else. He restrung nearly 1.5 miles of perimeter wire, patched the worst gaps with cedar posts he cut himself, and hauled a used 1,000-gallon tank out from town, filling it twice a week from a rented water truck. He put the mineral tub near the tank, the way he always had. On a cool morning in the 3rd week of April, with the fence finally holding, he turned the herd loose onto the new ground. That first afternoon, he noticed maybe a dozen cows drift toward the dead sycamore and stand there a while before moving on. He didn't think much of it. Cattle explore new ground. They walk fence lines, sniff at old fence posts, investigate anything that breaks the flatness of a field. A dead tree in the middle of open pasture was exactly the kind of thing that would draw a look. The second day, it was 27 head, standing there in the early afternoon, not eating, not lying down, just standing, some of them nose down at the base of the trunk. By the third day, it was close to the whole herd. Eli started paying real attention after that. They weren't seeking shade, the tree had no leaves left to give any, and hadn't for years, by the look of the bark and the bare, sun-bleached limbs. They weren't sheltering from wind. The breeze that week came steady from the south, and the tree stood in open ground with nothing to block. They weren't there for the mineral tub, because Eli had placed that at the far end of the field, nowhere near the tree, and the cows were walking past it to get to the sycamore instead. Some of them licked at a pale residue on a few half-buried stones near the roots. A couple sniffed at cracks in the ground and pawed lightly at the soil, the way a cow paws at ground it finds interesting but doesn't understand. And more than once, Eli watched a cow walk the 600 feet to the stock tank, drink her fill, and then walk straight back to stand at the tree again. He tried to rule out the easy explanations. He moved the mineral tub even farther away, past the drainage cut, to be sure they weren't chasing leftover salt. He watched them on a cool, overcast morning when heat and flies couldn't explain anything. He built a small temporary fence around the tree, mostly to keep them from wearing a bare patch into the ground. The cows didn't scatter. They stood outside the new fence in a loose crescent, facing the same spot they'd always faced. Eli didn't believe his cattle knew something he didn't. He'd run cattle too long to put stock in that kind of thinking. But he also knew better than to ignore 40 animals telling him the same thing 3 days running. "Cattle can tell you where to look," he said to his sister Ruth. That week, standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, "They cannot tell you what you're looking at." Ruth Mercer kept Eli's books, had done so for years, ever since her husband passed, and she'd needed something steady to occupy her ledger mind. She was not given to speculation, and she didn't offer any that day. She only asked him what he intended to do about it, and Eli told her he intended to look. He started with the ground itself. On his knees at the base of the tree, he found a curved line of fitted limestone just beneath the sod, more regular than anything nature would arrange on its own. The soil on the north side of the roots was darker than the rest of the field, and cooler to the touch, even at midday. A narrow strip of grass ran downhill, a shade greener than the grass around it, the kind of green that usually meant water moving close to the surface. When Eli pushed a length of rebar into the ground in a rough half-circle around the trunk, it went in easier in some spots than others, sinking through looser earth as if it were following something laid down on purpose, long before either of them were born. He asked around and was pointed toward Amos Bell, 72 years old, retired from the county road and drainage crew after 40 years of clearing culverts, tile lines, and old spring boxes that nobody else in the county remembered how to find. Amos came out on a Saturday, walked the ground slowly, and didn't say much for the better part of an hour. He crouched at the limestone, ran a thumb along the curve of it, looked at the dead tree a long while. "Maps remember what was filed," he said finally. "Ground remembers what was built. The cows gave you a place. Now the ground has to give you proof." They started clearing the following week, cutting back sod and brush with hand tools, careful not to tear up whatever lay underneath. What came up, inch by inch, was a ring of fitted limestone about 9 feet across a cistern, old enough that its mortar had crumbled to sand in places, with sycamore roots grown straight through cracks in the stonework like fingers through a fence. Part of the old lid had collapsed inward, buried under years of soil and roots. When they finally got a gap wide enough to look through, there was no pool of clear water waiting for them. There was several feet of leaf silt and black mud, a scattering of rotted root fragments, and, at the very bottom, only a few inches of standing water, cold and faintly mineral-smelling. Amos lowered a bucket on a rope and came back with less than half a gallon. Walter drove out that same week, looked down into the hole, and said what Eli half expected him to say. "You found a hole," he said. The map was still right about the water. Eli cleaned what he could and checked the recovery the next morning. 35 to 50 gallons had gathered overnight, not nothing, but nowhere near enough for 40 head of cattle in a Missouri summer. It looked, for a few days, like an old rainwater cistern that had outlived its usefulness by 20 years, exactly the kind of thing that explained a curious set of cows and nothing more. Ruth asked him the question directly, the way she asked most things. How much money are you willing to spend? Proving 40 cows were not just standing out of the wind. Eli didn't have a good answer for her that week, but he kept going anyway, because something about the recovery rate bothered him. It was slow, but it was steady, not the kind of trickle he'd expect from a hole that only caught rain. It was Amos who found it, working the north wall of the cistern with a trowel, clearing silt from a spot where the stonework looked different from the rest. Behind a plug of packed roots and clay, he uncovered the mouth of a buried tile line, old vitrified clay pipe, running away from the cistern and uphill toward a hedgerow roughly 200 feet off. The cistern, it turned out, had never been just a rainwater tank. Somewhere back before either of their memories, it had been fed by a shallow limestone seep, caught and channeled through a small spring box built into the hillside, then carried down by gravity through clay tile into the cistern below. It was a simple system, the kind farms had used before anyone thought to drill for water, and it had worked for who knew how many decades before it failed. It had failed, they came to understand, slowly. The sycamore had grown up close to the cistern generations back, drawn by the moisture that gathered there, and over the years its roots had found their way into the tile line itself, first cracking a joint, then choking it outright. With the pipe blocked, water began moving around it underground instead of into the cistern, finding its own paths through the loose limestone shelf. A dry summer, some old lightning damage, and a slow rot at the heart of the trunk had finished the tree off years later, but the blockage inside the pipe had already been there long before that. The dead tree had not found the water, Eli said to Amos, standing over the open cistern that afternoon. It grew from it, hid it, and finally helped choke the line that had kept it alive. Restoration was slow, dirty, unglamorous work, and it took most of May and half of June. Eli shoveled silt out of the cistern bucket by bucket. He cut roots by hand, a section of saw blade at a time, careful not to disturb the stonework any more than the roots already had, and mixed mortar to stabilize the worst of the cracked limestone. Following the buried line uphill with the same probe rod he'd used to find the cistern's edge, he located the old spring box under the hedgerow, half collapsed and choked with silt. He replaced 60 to 90 feet of broken clay tile with polypipe, built a simple gravel filter at the spring box to keep sediment out, fitted a new concrete lid over the cistern, fenced the whole thing off from the cattle, and ran a gravity line down to a stock tank in the open field. It did not go smoothly the first time. After the initial cleaning, the flow improved for a few days and then dropped again. A second section of old tile had given way further up the line, and for a short while Eli believed what he'd uncovered was only leftover rainwater working its way out of saturated ground. Nothing renewable, nothing worth the money he'd already spent. It was Amos who noticed the pattern didn't fit that theory. After a light rain, the flow into the cistern didn't spike right away the way runoff would. It rose slowly, hours later, the way water moves through limestone. They found the second collapse not far from the first, cleared it, and the flow steadied for good. By the time Eli finished the last of the pipework, in the heat of late June, the system was producing somewhere between 700 and 900 gallons a day, feeding into a cistern that held between 2,500 and 3,000 gallons in storage. The whole job, pipe, fittings, gravel, wire, a used stock tank, a rented pump for a few days, and materials for the new lid came to just under $1,300. The drilled well Curtis Fain had quoted him back in April would have run closer to $10,800, with no guarantee attached to a single dollar of it. Summer of 1988 turned dry across Barton County, the kind of dry that showed up first in the ponds. Walter's pond dropped 2 feet by mid-July and kept dropping. He started hauling water for part of his herd and moved the rest to rented ground west of town. Eli's system was tested in a way no amount of planning could have faked. Every morning the herd drank the tank down low within an hour, and every morning it climbed back up through the day, refilled steadily by the slow, patient flow out of the hillside. The spring did not have to outrun 40 cows. It only had to keep running after they walked away. Eli treated the source with more care than confidence. He kept a notebook of flow readings, taped inside the truck's glove box. He rotated pasture to ease pressure on the ground near the spring box. He fenced the box itself off from anything that might disturb it, and during the hottest stretch of the summer, the last week of July, he hauled one emergency load of water anyway, unwilling to test the system further than he had to. It was not a season of unlimited water. It was a season of careful management that happened to be enough. Late in August, with his own pond nearly gone, Walter drove out to see it for himself. He watched the tank sit low after the morning drinking, then watched it climb again through the afternoon, fed by a line no thicker than a man's wrist. "That little line keeps up with 40 head?" Walter asked. "Not while they're drinking," Eli said. "It keeps up after they leave." Walter looked out toward the fenced-off cistern and the bare white trunk standing above it. "So the cows knew there was a cistern under there?" "No," Eli said. "They knew something about that ground was different. The rest was our job." Walter was quiet a moment. "I was right about the tree being dead," he said. "You were wrong about what died with it," Eli answered, and left it there. There was nothing more that needed saying between them. The county updated the farm record that fall. The old line, no developed water source, was struck through and replaced with a new one, restored spring-fed cistern with gravity livestock water system. Between the water system, the repaired fencing, and pasture that had come back thicker after a season of rest and rotation, the appraiser raised the property's value from $18,000 to somewhere between $31,000 and $34,000. It was not a fortune. It was enough that Eli didn't have to sell down his herd that fall, enough that he kept every calf the cows had given him that spring. Eli cut the dangerous limbs off the dead sycamore that autumn, the ones hanging loose enough to fall on a cow or a man working underneath. He left the trunk standing, bare and white against the winter grass, a landmark the way the county had always used it, though for a different reason now. Late that November, moving the herd toward the stock tank on a cold morning, one of the older cows broke from the group and stood a few seconds beside the fenced-off tree, the way she must have done 100 times that summer before the fence went up. Then she turned and followed the rest down toward the water, walking the same worn path the whole herd had cut into the grass since spring. The county map had marked the tree and missed the water. The cattle had missed neither.